Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Nicole Sampson, Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences and Distinguished Professor of Chemistry here at Stony Brook University. And I'm so pleased to welcome you to our Truth, Science, and Free Speech virtual town hall, which is presented by the Center for the Changing Systems of Power. Thank you all for joining us on, at least on the East Coast, is what a beautiful afternoon and for what is sure to be an informative presentation. While there seems to be a light at the end of the tunnel in regard to the lingering COVID pandemic, we still find ourselves in the midst of global, social, and political unrest. And we're fortunate to have entities such as the Center of Changing Systems of Power, or CCSP, situated to address the bigger issues and questions facing our society today. The center's mission aligns with and animates the College of Arts and Sciences mission to educate students with research findings and discoveries to help solve complex societal problems so they may better understand the interconnectedness of our political and social systems and how to take constructive actions as responsible citizens of the world to lead change in our society on and off campus. Over the past year, the CCSP has sponsored or co-sponsored important presentations, including the killing of George Floyd and the resulting protests for social justice, the global dimensions of Black Lives Matter, The Dead Are Rising, The Life of Malcolm X, and the recent Breaking Silence public forum on anti-AAPI racism. Through the generous support of CCSP Advisory Board member and Stony Brook alumna Myrna Chow, the center recently awarded its first round of faculty grants to 6 teams in support of their cutting-edge research efforts. This fall, the center will be hosting additional public sessions like this one, and will sponsor its first professional conference during the 21-22 academic year. Now, I would like to introduce Dr. Charles L. Robbins, who is Executive Director of the Center for Changing Systems of Power, who will say a few words about the center's role. Dr. Robbins is a faculty member in the School of Social Welfare and is affiliated with the program in public health. He was the inaugural lead in Stony Brook's involvement with UN Women's He for She campaign for gender equality. He was appointed the State University of New York, otherwise known as SUNY, coordinator for the UN Women's He for She campaign for gender equality. Dr. Robbins actively supports the work of MCW, Global, the Long Island LGBT Services Network, the Children's Defense Fund, and Young Men for Gender Equality. And he is a frequent speaker at local, national, and international conferences. Dr. Robbins' research and professional work focus on issues of social justice, gender equality, men and masculinity, higher education, and student success and intimate partner violence. And so now I'd like to turn it over to you, Dr. Robbins.
Thank you, Dean Sampson. We're really excited at the Center for Changing Systems of Power to be able to sponsor this important program today. As you've laid out, we've been doing this for a year now, and it's really a pleasure to welcome all of you to today's program. To provide some context for today's program, I'm going to start by referencing a recent article which appeared in the New York Times on May 7th. The article, "Belonging is Stronger Than Facts, The Age of Misinformation," was written by Max Fisher. In it, he wrote, "We are in an era of endemic misinformation and outright disinformation. Plenty of bad actors are helping the trend along, but the real drivers, some experts believe, are social and psychological forces that make people prone to sharing and believing misinformation in the first place. And those forces are only on the rise." Brendan Nyan, a Dartmouth College political scientist, posed in a recent paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that a growing body of evidence suggests that the ultimate culprits are cognitive and memory limitations, directional motivations to defend or support some group identity or existing belief, and messages from other people and political elites. People become more prone to misinformation when 3 things happen. First, when conditions in society make people feel a greater need for what social scientists call in-grouping, a belief that their social identity is a source of strength and superiority, and that other groups can be blamed for their problems. Second, driver of the misinformation era is the emergence of high-profile political figures who encourage their followers to indulge their desire for self-affirming misinformation. And then the third factor is a shift to social media, which is a powerful outlet for composers of disinformation, a pervasive vector for misinformation itself, and a multiplier of the other risk factors. In a recent study published in Nature just last month, a team of psychologists tracked thousands of users interacting with false information. Republican test subjects who were shown a false headline about migrants trying to enter the United States identified it as false. Only 16% called it accurate. But when challenged by the experimenters about whether they would share the headline, 51% said that they would repost. Obviously leads to some of what we're dealing with today. The sociologist Zeynep Tufekci wrote in the MIT Technology Review that in an ecosystem where that sense of identity conflict is all-consuming, belonging is stronger than the facts. So that's the background for today's program. As we go through the speakers, you can put questions for the full panel or individual speakers in the chat box, and we'll try to get to as many as time permits. And with that, I'm going to first introduce our panel members and then our keynote speaker. Stephanie Kelton is a professor of economics and public policy here at Stony Brook University and author of the New York Times bestselling book, The Deficit Myth: Modern Monetary Theory and the Birth of the People's Economy. Professor Kelton is a senior fellow at the Schwartz Center for Economic Policy Analysis at the New School for Social Research and a former chief economist on the US Senate Budget Committee. She served as the chief economic advisor to the presidential campaigns of Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont. In 2016, she was named by Politico as one of the 50 people most influencing the policy debate in America. As one of the 50 people who defined 2019 by Bloomberg Businessweek, one of Barron's top 100 women in finance in both 2020 and 2021, and by Prospect Magazine in 2020 as one of the world's top 50 thinkers. We are also joined by Sarah Nelson, who has served as the international president of the Association of Flight Attendants, CWA AFL-CIO, since 2014. She first became a union member in 1996 when she was hired as a flight attendant at United Airlines, and today represents nearly 50,000 of aviation's first responders at 17 airlines. She believes that flight attendants can play a pivotal role in strengthening the labor movement with more public contact than almost any other job and access to every corner of the earth. She is an outspoken labor leader, an advocate, and was seen frequently discussing the impact of COVID-19 on her members and the airline industry as a whole. John Barry Ryan is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science, also here at Stony Brook University. He is the author of many articles on public opinion and political campaigns, and is currently the department's director of undergraduate studies. He is also a member of the Interdisciplinary Center for Behavioral Political Economy. He graduated from Boston College with a BA in Communications and received his PhD in Political Science. His earlier book in 2014, Experts, Activists, and Democratic Politics, Are Electorates Self-Educating, is particularly relevant today. His latest book, The Other Divide, Polarism and Disengagement in American Politics, co-authored with fellow Stony Brook political scientist Yana Krupnikoff, will be published by Cambridge University Press early next year. And I welcome all of you to the panel today. Our keynote speaker is Ali Velshi, MSNBC anchor and business correspondent for both NBC News and MSNBC. He brings his sharp analysis and point of view to the weekend morning show Velshi, airing from 8 to 10 Eastern Time on Saturdays and Sundays on MSNBC. I never miss it. Your focus yesterday on AAPI hate and violence was incredible, so thank you for doing that. Velshi has covered a wide range of domestic, global, and economic issues throughout his career, including climate change, the spread and defeat of ISIS, the refugee crisis, the Iran nuclear deal, tensions between Russia and the West, the Greek debt crisis, and the global financial crisis. More recently, he has reported on the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter demands for justice, the Capitol insurrection, and the global COVID-19 pandemic. Prior to joining NBC News and MSNBC in 2016, he hosted Ali Velshi on Target, a nightly primetime show on Al Jazeera America. But before that, he was CNN's chief business correspondent, anchor of CNN International's World Business Today, and host of CNN's weekly business roundtable. Velshi also co-hosted CNN's morning show, American Morning. He's an award-winning journalist who was honored with the National Headliner Award for Business and Consumer Reporting for How the Wheels Came Off, a special on the near collapse of the American auto industry. His work on disabled workers in Chicago's red light camera scandal in 2016 earned him 2 News and Documentary Emmy Award nominations, adding to his previous nomination for terrorism coverage. He has taken his economic analysis to Oprah, The View, and The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, among others. He's the author of Give Me My Money Back and co-author with CNN's Christine Romans of How to Speak Money. Ali was born in Kenya and raised in Canada, and he graduated from Queen's University in Canada, which bestowed an honorary doctorate of laws upon him in 2016. He splits his time between New York City and Philadelphia, where he teaches a course at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. He serves on the board of trustees of the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at the City University of New York, the Chicago History Museum, Seeds of Peace, the X Prize Foundation, the National Constitution Center, and the Philadelphia Citizen. He is also an active member of the Council on Foreign Relations. I've gotten to know Ali over the years through our mutual support of the NGO MCW Global. I am particularly proud to say that he is a member of the Center for Changing Systems of Power Advisory Board. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Ali Velshi.
Thank you, Charles. That's embarrassing, that whole intro, considering that I got no reason being a keynote speaker with the panelists who you've got here. Sarah and I, like you and I, Sarah and I have had a lot of conversations over the last year and a bit. She is certainly one of the most foremost labor leaders I've ever met, not just in America. She's just at the front of a system that is changing and needs changing. And Stephanie and I have more recently had a chance to talk in depth about the way we look at economics and how those things need to change. And we're in this fantastic moment where things can change. There's a call for things to change. The world needs things to change. America needs things to change. And the pandemic has presented us with an opportunity to look at things that the way we do things and think about them differently. I have been, over the last year, really on a listening tour. It started with the death of George Floyd, where I covered the protests across the country, but that led to weekly conversations with small groups of Americans about politics. There were Americans from across the political spectrum around the social justice issues, about the pandemic, speaking to small business owners about their struggles, speaking to people about their economic struggles with the pandemic. In fact, I'm here in San Francisco. I wasn't expecting to be here. I'm coming to you from a hotel room, which I think we've done an okay job with setting up the shot. Don't need to see the empty water bottle there. But I'm coming to you from San Francisco because I just met with 6 Asian Americans. And I learned more than, it's a topic I thought I know something about, but I've learned so much more. Asian Americans have been in this country since before the founding of this country. But as you know, San Francisco is home to one of the largest and oldest Asian American communities. And I had people on my panel who were, one woman had recently come to America from Hong Kong. One was born in Malaysia of Vietnamese parents and came here as a young girl. one of them was sixth generation, one of them was fifth, one of them was fourth, one of them was third generation. And yet they are confronting this reality of hate and discrimination and inequality, and realizing the intersectionality between them and Black people in America, and the intersection between them and people coming across the southern border, because the way people coming across the southern border are being treated is reminiscent of how Asians were treated when they came to America. And these points of intersection are coming together in the last year. And what we are realizing is those who don't get paid fairly versus those who don't get treated fairly by police or the justice system versus those who are subject to attack. There is remarkable intersectionality between these groups. They need the same things. And if those same things look something like equality in the context of our union in the United States, why not fix a lot of them? People are unequal in this country for several reasons, one of which is wage, one of which is color, another of which is education levels. Healthcare is I come from Canada, where it's just not the great inequalizer. It is not something that when you get ill, you think you're going to lose your job, or if you lose your job, you can't deal with the fact that you've become ill. So it's all come together over the course of the last year in my reporting. And I realized when I first got out to the streets of Minneapolis, two things happened that became very clear to me. First of all, this issue of free speech became prominent, because what we do in this country is when people get angry, they protest. When they protest, we put curfews on them, and then we, this becomes a tense situation. And there were curfews in Minneapolis, as you know, in the days following the death of George Floyd. And on one particular night, after the curfew, police and protesters got into clashes. They shot tear gas and other projectiles at protesters. A police station was taken over. I mean, it was a remarkable night at the end of May of last year. And of course, there were some expectations. Police had killed a man on video. And the general feeling in this corner of Minneapolis in which I was standing in front of the 3rd precinct was people who were saying to me, as we were watching looting and rioting and burning and things, people were saying to me, what more did they need? What more did they want? They'll catch a Black man for doing anything in America, but we actually have video. We have lots of angles. At that point, we had 3 different angles of video. Little did we know we'd have far more than that. And the police had not been arrested. And that was what the protest was about. If the police had been arrested in Minneapolis, those protests would have had a very different flavor to them starting, a night or two after the death of George Floyd. But now we were at Friday night. And it did not look like justice was even a possibility. So people did what was available to them. And sometimes that was trashing a store that had nothing to do with it. But when you start to realize how some people think about things, and I say this as the child of parents who grew up as anti-apartheid activists in South Africa, if at some point you realize that the law's not there to protect you and society's not there to protect you and the rules are not there for you, what obligation do you have to subscribe to those same rules or to uphold the rules? That's not a justification, by the way, of violence or looting or stealing of any sort. It is just the stuff I was hearing on the streets of Minneapolis. And then by that Saturday night, George Floyd was killed on Memorial Day. He was killed on a Monday. By Saturday night, this one police station had been burned down, and the protesters had marched and moved to another police station, the 5th precinct. And just before the curfew was supposed to go into effect, everybody sat down at an intersection outside of the police station, which again is very classic civil disobedience. Don't harm anybody, don't hurt anybody. You are going to resist arrest. You have been warned you will be arrested, which means it's likely you will be arrested, but you are there to protest what you feel is injustice. And then moments after that, everybody got up and started walking. And I was about 2/3 of the way back in the crowd. For a lot of reasons, we try as journalists not to be at the front of the crowd, not to sort of provoke anything, and sort of try and observe what's going on. So we're about 2/3 of the way back. They were walking a lot. It was a couple of miles, I think we had probably walked. It was very, very peaceful. They were walking at a pace that a guy like me likes to walk at. I'm not that athletic. There was some chanting, there was some singing, there were clumps of people in that protest who I'm not even sure that that was entirely their protest. They were just there to show support. And then suddenly at the intersection in front of me, lights, sirens, police, National Guard, all get into this one block. They're right in the middle of the crowd. They've come into the absolute middle of this crowd of thousands of people. They disperse the crowd, start shooting tear gas in either direction, and rubber bullets. Now I was quite far, I was about 2/3 back in that crowd, but now I was at the front because they had split the crowd, and everybody who didn't have a gas mask had run backwards. So we travel, weirdly enough, now with gas masks and hardened helmets and a flak jacket, which I've had for years, but I've never, ever, ever, ever used in the United States. Now it's routine for us to travel with these things, believe it or not. I had all my stuff and I had a gas mask. I wasn't actually wearing it in the moment. And this was about 8:45 Eastern. And my wife texted me that this seems a little hairy, and my mother was texting me that she was a little bit worried about this, and my boss texted me about something, and I was sort of trying to tell everybody, it's okay, we got this. We're journalists, we know how to do this. And suddenly I get hit by a rubber bullet. And I thought that was strange. We should have been very clearly identifiable to the police. The police also knew there were journalists. I mean, this is night 5 of this thing. They have to know that we're all out there. They hit us, and interesting enough, and I don't know whoever shot at me knew that they were shooting at me. Rubber bullets are this interesting thing because they're actually rubber covered metal bullets. We'd been hit by tear gas and marker rounds and all that for a few days. That night, by the way, about 200 journalists were injured by authorities and police. Not a single journalist was injured by a protester anywhere in America that weekend. They were injured by police or National Guard. One journalist lost their eye. A number of my colleagues were very badly injured. I ran into Ed Liu of NBC, and his face was all bleeding. We walked back. We were trying to get out of this thing, and we walked to the intersection behind us. And by that time, all the protesters had left because there'd been so much tear gas and police activity that they knew to disperse. So it was just media. There must have been 10 of us or something like that. My group from NBC and some other, I think they might have been Italian media or something like that, walking toward an intersection to go back to leave. And police and National Guard pulled into that intersection. So now we've just gone through this experience. I'm smart enough now to indicate that, okay, if you just know that we're media and you're not mistaking us for anything else, you're not going to shoot, right? So we all put our hands up and said, we're media. To which the response was, we know. And they shot us a second time. Nobody got hit, but they absolutely knew they were shooting at the media. Now, that's an assault on the First Amendment. I don't think that I deserve better protection than any other civilian in America. They shouldn't be shooting at anybody. But that is an effort when you deliberately target the media, which, by the way, the president at the time was encouraging, you silence us. The Washington Post says democracy dies in darkness. And the only 2 jobs we have as media, there are only 2 things that any journalist needs to do in life. The first one is to bear witness, simply to demonstrate what is happening, to show people this is happening. It's why we go out in hurricanes. It's why we go to refugee camps. It's why we show you that this is happening because you deserve to know. And you can make any decision, choice, or judgment based on the things we show you. Our job is to show you. Our second job is to hold power to account, because we get access to people that our viewers, our readers, and our listeners do not. So I have the ability to access people who I can hold to account. But if I cannot bear witness in the first place, how can I hold anybody to account? How can I say, why did you shoot those people? Why did you do that? If I don't know that it was done. So people texted me and tweeted me after that whole incident and said, why were you people even out there? It was a curfew. It's like, well, the curfews are not for us. We are there to show you what is happening, because wouldn't it be fantastic if authority could guarantee that the media was not there to demonstrate what is going on? That would be fantastic. Even I would like to be an elected official if there were to be no accountability, if no one could ever say, hey, we know you did that. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. It's why some police officers still agree. Some police chiefs say, we want those cameras because it'll tell the truth all the time. It'll tell you what's going on. We had Black people telling us for years that the worst moment for a Black parent is when their kid gets a driver's license, because it is their entry into the criminal justice system. Until that time, a parent could, generally speaking, protect their children from something. But once you get into your driver's license, you drive your car, your tail light is out, which, you know, some old cars, you don't know that inside the car. You get pulled over, you get a ticket, you can't pay the ticket becomes a bigger fine, which becomes a bench warrant. Then you get stopped one day and you are a criminal. Dante Wright, outside of Minneapolis, was pulled over ostensibly because he was hanging an air freshener from his car, which you're not allowed to do in Minneapolis, in Minnesota, which is a bit of a stupid rule, but whatever. And then he's got a warrant out. This is how our society gets out of control. This is why people think things are not fair. This is why George Floyd went from a guy in a store who might have been written up on a ticket for something into being dead. And so this idea of bearing witness, this idea of showing people what's going on and what is not fair became very prevalent over the course of the last year. And what it morphed into, where this pandemic and essential workers and low-paid people and minimum wage and immigrants and people subject to inequality all came together, is where they realized that while we are bearing witness, while we are understanding that things need to change, why don't we change a lot of it? Why don't we become fair? Why don't we hold everybody to a higher standard? Why don't we hold ourselves as taxpayers and voters to a higher standard as well? Why don't we get out of the society in which we are blaming everybody for everything, and we are saying there are structural failures in our society? So whatever you think is wrong with society, what if you actually said, how do we fix these things? Sarah and I had conversations a year ago about how do we fix some of these things about how people survive through the course of this pandemic properly and for the long term, so we don't have to make bad decisions moving forward. And so we have had a year in which those of us who are engaged in this conversation can have it more fully. We can have it in the context of everything, and this is where Stephanie Kelton comes in, because she's talking about majorly different ways of looking at the economy and how we think of budgeting and how we think of deficits and how we think of spending and how we think of taxing. These are hard things to change. Sarah's talking about things in labor that are hard things to change. We're talking about increasing a minimum wage from $7.25 to $15 an hour, doubling the federal minimum wage. That's hard. And that's hard for small businesses who say, I can't even make a go of it right now. How will I do that? So we have to have those conversations. How does that happen? Over what period of time? And frankly, while we're looking at all this stuff, let's look at healthcare. Let's look at why every other major developed nation in the world manages to cover everybody for healthcare and not make them fearful of dying because they do not have employer-sponsored healthcare or a job. And let's look at how the world, today we've announced that we're going to be giving 20 million doses of vaccine to other countries. Why didn't we understand this months ago? Why wasn't there a global and international effort to deal with the pandemic the way in 2008, when we had a global recession, we had a global coordinated response to it? While we're looking at the situation in the Middle East, talk about changing paradigms. That's one we really have to look at, because whatever you think about what's going on in the Middle East, whomever you hold responsible for what's happening in the Middle East, America has a role in it and has, for the moment, abdicated that role. And hopefully we're getting back in and being able to play a role. There are a whole bunch of people who think America is not an honest broker there, but that's hard work, right? That's the hard work of saying, this is what we do. We believe in justice and fairness, and we will impose that. While everybody was sleeping, by the way, and while there was a pandemic, and while there was all this going on, and a US president that didn't care about this, Hong Kong has gone from being a gem in the world to one of the worst places for democratically inclined people to live. Crimea is still in the hands of the Russians. Myanmar has become a disaster. Lots of things are happening right now that require our attention. So this idea, Charlie, of thinking about systems and change and how we do it, this is the moment to do it. On every level, whether it's racism, whether it's policing, whether it's justice, whether it's the environment, whether it's labor, whether it's economics or global affairs. This is the moment that we are in to say, change everything. Normally you have to break something to change it. It's already broken. It is broken. It is ripe and ready for better ideas, for equality, for social justice. These are not and never should be partisan issues. This should be bipartisan. We need equality. This country is built on that concept. We have not ever perfected it, but we get that. We get that we are moving toward a more perfect union. We don't have the more perfect union or the most perfect union now, but people have died in the Civil War to achieve greater perfection. They have died in the suffrage movement to achieve greater perfection, in the civil rights movement, and now in this movement that we are seeing. May this not go to waste. My whole hope is that in 25 years, we look back at 2020 and 2021, and all of us who were on the front lines of this thing to say, we were not asleep at the switch. We understood that this was the opportunity to make things better, and that we do it now. And so this opportunity is in front of us. The struggles are not anywhere close to being over. There is a sense among some that the urgency is reduced because Donald Trump is not there. That's inaccurate. In fact, the sentiments and the strains that propelled Donald Trump and that Donald Trump encouraged remain and are possibly stronger than they were when he was in office. So if you thought things needed to change last year, things need to change even more this year. I'll leave it at that because those are some of my observations, and you've got an expert panel who will have much more to say about it.
Thank you so much for kicking us off. That was incredible, and I know that the panelists are going to have a lot to respond to, and I'm sure we'll have a lot to discuss about that. But that was really inspiring. So thank you so much for that. First up will be as I said, it'll be in the order of introduction. So Stephanie will go first. Stephanie Kelton.
You know, after a gazillion Zooms, you're supposed to know to unmute yourself. Thank you, Charles. Ali is an impossible act to follow, so shame on you for the ordering of the remarks at this point. You know, look, I think that there's so much I want to say in response to what Ali just said. This idea that things need to change. Sarah and I served together in the summer of 2020 on one of the unity task forces that was set up between then President-elect Biden and Senator Bernie Sanders. And we were on the task force on the economy. There were 8 of us. And we spent a lot of time over the summer months, hours upon hours, where one of us would say, and I think this was my line that I repeated again and again and again, is that, yes, the pieces have all fallen apart. And Ali just said it's broken, so we have to fix it. It's all broken. And the point that I kept making throughout those discussions is that in the breaking and the falling apart of all these pieces, there lies an opportunity, right? And if you just simply pick up the pieces and try to quickly reassemble them the way they were assembled before, you're building back a system with the same vulnerabilities that COVID exposed. So this is what we want to avoid. The goal is to put the pieces together differently so that they are stronger, so that we deal with some of the vulnerabilities, the precarities, and the relationship between employment and healthcare and the whole range of structural inequities across the system and so forth. So yes, we have an opportunity here. And I think, you know, I'm optimistic in many ways about where we've gone, you know, since the coronavirus pandemic and where we might go in the months and years ahead. You know, if you think back to 2019, right, pre-COVID, we had a presidential race underway, a very crowded field of Democratic hopefuls with policy agendas ranging from really, really ambitious stuff, right? Let's cancel all outstanding student loan debt. Let's have Medicare for all. Let's have free college. Let's have big infrastructure. Let's do a Green New Deal. Let's do, right, big, bold, multi-trillion-dollar stuff. And then, you know, gradually getting more modest in terms of the aspirations. But everybody had an agenda. Everybody wanted to fix something. And everyone also had something else, a way to pay for it. right? Everybody had a way to pay for all of the spending that they were proposing. And what happened, if you remember what those debates were like to watch, is that all of the bickering focused on the paying for part. Oh, your taxes won't raise as much revenue as you think they will. Oh, that's not going to work. Oh, this. We never really debated the merits of the policy. We got bogged down in the deficit and the financing of the spending. And so that's what we were dealing with in 2019. Fast forward, coronavirus comes. All of that goes out the window, right? 2020 is a very different game. March of 2020, Congress spins out its first multi-trillion-dollar package, the CARES Act. $2.2 trillion goes out. Nobody stopped and said, how are we going to pay for this? Where is the money going to come from? Why? Because Congress deemed this a high priority, and not just that, a risk and a threat to all of us. And that's what mattered. It's that all of us were vulnerable in that moment. So Congress got together, passed the legislation. If the votes are there, the money is there. The money goes out the door. Then they drag their feet through the summer and into the fall. By December, we got another package, $900 billion this time, out the door. And then the Democrats win. Biden becomes president. And we get a $1.9 trillion COVID relief package that is going to do, among other things, lift half of all the kids in this country out of poverty temporarily, right? But it's going to do a lot of good for a broad range of working class and low income, poor people in this country. So the point is, when we deem something urgent, we can address these problems, and not just during a crisis like coronavirus, but coming out of COVID with the Build Back Better agenda, which is now on the table. The Biden administration wants some $4.1 trillion in additional spending, in part to deal with things like climate change, with our crumbling roads and bridges, with inadequate and unaffordable child care, with a lack of elder care for seniors and low wages and all the rest of it. So it's there, it's tantalizing, it's on the table, but the pay for question is back. And so, anybody who's been paying attention to the debates as they unfold knows that what is holding everything up is this battle over how to offset the spending, how to keep this round of spending from adding to the deficit the way prior rounds of spending did. And this is where I think this, conversation then brings us back into the myths and the misinformation and disinformation, because there's a lot of that when it comes to understanding public finances, government spending, the deficit, the national debt. And, it's weaponized because so many people do have, I think, an inaccurate understanding of these things. The media weaponizes it, politicians weaponize it, makes it much more difficult to move forward with a lot of this really important, these investments that we can make in the economy right now when we are bogged down in a political discussion that is all revolving around how to find the money to do this, when we just spent 15 months demonstrating that if Congress deems something a priority, the money can always be there. So I'll stop and let Sarah have a word. And I know we can come back to some of this later on.
Thank you. That was great. Sarah, you're up next.
Thank you so much. So first of all, I'm feeling very badly about texting Ali as he's in the middle of getting hit with rubber bullets, as he's describing he's getting messages from his wife and his producer and everything. I'm like, oh, I shouldn't have been texting. But I remember watching that moment. And Stephanie and I were serving on the Biden-Sanders Unity Task Force at the time, focusing on the economy. And I remember this because starting in January of 2020, the people that I represent, flight attendants, were already facing coronavirus before this was really something that was well known and understood, and people had any concept at all about how this was going to completely disrupt their lives this year. So we were already dealing with that, but we were dealing with the first two issues that this seminar is about. We were dealing with truth and science not being supported by the former administration. And that had been so different than what we had experienced up to that point in every other situation where there was a communicable disease outbreak. And we understood that we had to make a real effort to stop the spread at transportation's door. So we know what it looks like when government has a plan, when they coordinate with private industry, when they bring all the stakeholders in, unions are at the table to talk about that, make sure that people on the front lines have what they need to reinforce that science and truth and information about what's going on. And none of that was going on. And so here we were trying to make the most out of working with private industry to put the best policies in place without any kind of backing. And not only did we not have backing or a plan from the federal government, we had misinformation, disinformation, and a rejection of science. And so the only way that we heard about what was happening in the workplaces was usually where you had a union. And so you had the power of the collective behind the workers to make sure that if they're speaking out, there's no retaliation against them because they've got that support from the union. But we're down to 6% in the private workforce in this country that actually have that backing of the union to be able to tell those stories. So free speech is also supported by having that power of the collective and that legal standing with unions. And so I think about all that. I think about the work that we were doing to address the issues in the workplace for our safety and health, and then also the economic response. And for us, having experienced a crisis previously with 9/11 and the impact that had on our industry, on our jobs, all the bankruptcies that followed, and then the consolidation, all of which was used to try to weaken the unions, try to cut our contracts, to do away with our pensions, cut our pay, and get us to agree to what almost every other industry in America had agreed to, which had been high productivity. So more time on the job. We fought for the 8-hour day 100 years ago and won it. And yet today, we're still fighting for these things. Our rights are never absolute. This is another thing I think is really, really key for us to understand when we're talking about changing systems of power, that we have to understand that the struggle for the people to protect those first words that Ali referenced earlier in our Constitution, we the people, not we the corporations, not we the guy who thinks he's going to build a spaceship and leave all of us on the burning earth, but we the people, in order to form a more perfect union. And of course, I love the fact that it references the word union, but what Ali also recognized is that there's a recognition right up front in the preamble of our Constitution that we're not perfect, that we have to keep working on being more perfect. And so that takes constant struggle. And we have to be okay with that. We have to be okay with the constant struggle. There is no such thing as labor management peace, for example, because there's always going to be the desire in capitalism to take more and more money, right? And to extract more and more, and to think of labor as a line item. And so what we did in responding to coronavirus, when we had to look at the economic impact, as first we're facing the danger on the job, going to work and doing this, and then facing immediately a 97% drop off in demand for our work, we had to address both issues at the same time. And so we put forward a plan that said, if you're going to do relief, it needs to be focused on the workers. We're going to build this very differently. We're going to build it from the ground up, because what we've seen before is, we've got to protect the companies. We've got to protect the corporations. And then that will steady everything for everyone else. They'll provide the jobs. They'll provide the benefits. If we don't have that, we're not going to have any of that in place. So we said, no. This time, we're going to focus relief around the workers. And so we proposed a payroll support program that would bring federal relief to the airlines to use the same payroll support systems to continue paying our taxes, so that we're supporting those local and state budgets, to continue the jobs for sanitation workers and mass transit, and to make sure that our schools are getting the resources they need to be able to continue to teach our children in this new environment. All of these things, we continued that, but we also continued to get a paycheck, stay on the job, not overburden our safety net program with unemployment that we saw so very clearly has been decimated as well, where state governments have worked to pull these systems of government apart. And we also capped executive compensation and banned stock buybacks. So we built a system that actually supported the people from the ground up. And it was the idea of rebuilding our economy in that way. But now what we have to do coming out of coronavirus is understand that we have this shared experience that has pulled the Band-Aid off and has shown us all the problems in our economy and all the problems in our society. The corporate elite have kept people at odds with each other, kept people from forming unions, kept the collective from gaining control of our democracy by dividing, delaying on any advancements, on distracting people with social media misinformation, and demoralizing people, making people believe that there's nothing they can do to make a change. So back to those nights in Minneapolis where Ali is reporting from there, telling us the story about what's going on, bearing witness to what's happening. I think about the extraordinary moment that was, because people had been taught that the way to take care of each other was to remain in your homes at this time and to isolate. And that was an action of solidarity, staying in our homes and not coming together, not spreading the virus. But in this moment where there was an effort to have us so demoralized that we would actually watch a man being killed, a Black man being killed and videotaped, and there being no remorse there, no idea that that was anything that was wrong. People poured out into the streets and said, enough. You're not going to demoralize us. You're not going to divide us. You're not going to delay a response to this. We're going to ask for action right now. And so it was this extraordinary moment where our economy was colliding with all of these issues, the efforts to try to give us misinformation, the efforts to try to have us deny science, the efforts to try to keep us silent and isolated. It all was being uncovered. The inequities in our society, the fact that we did not have a system that was ready to support people in the middle of a crisis, the fact that people were already stretched to the nth degree, and that most people took a cut when coronavirus cut back on hours for everyone, because everyone had been making this country work based on high productivity. So right away, losing overtime hours, you're losing half of your income as well. Enough is enough. The problems have been defined. And through the unions, we're able to tell the individual stories of people to keep defining those problems at the ground level, then setting the clear demands because we've got so much in common about what's wrong, adding the urgency to this moment, and then backing it up with what we're willing to do. What people said in those nights in May and early June was that they were willing to risk their lives to defend the lives of people who are persecuted just because of the color of their skin. Not only in the streets, not only through our police, but in our economic system in total. So in any case, we need to use this moment to make sure that the majority are continuing to drive this country forward by ending the filibuster, by making sure that we are getting out of our system any ability for the corporate elite to simply retaliate against workers who are just saying, I just want to meet you at the table and be able to speak my truth, be able to make my demands and have you have to meet them, and not have all the power over me in my workplace and for my family when I'm isolated and on my own. So that's how I would start out. I've gone on a little bit long, but define the problem, set the demands, add the urgency, and back up what you're willing to do with it. And our unions are a huge part of making that possible for the collective.
Thank you. I think the intersectionality that you're all talking about is really the most critical issue. And how do we marshal that and pull that together in order to be able to stop pointing fingers at others and disbelieving what we're seeing with our own eyes and try to bring about the change that you're all talking about. John.
Okay, bringing about change. So in most of the stuff I'm going to talk about, I'm going to go with data that we've collected, public opinion data. So I'm talking about citizen level stuff, right? So when I talk about people being polarized or at odds, I'm not talking about McConnell versus Schumer. I'm talking about some dude named Chuck and some dude named Mitch, who are voters generally. And so if we're going to bring about change, one of the easiest ways to bring about change, is to come up with a problem that everybody agrees upon. And in our data, one of the things that Ali mentioned and has been mentioned, healthcare. is that agreement across parties, across what we would call involvement levels or animosity across parties, healthcare, but it's very specific. It's about the cost of healthcare. The question about insurance, big divide on that, but how much healthcare costs. So then you'd say, okay, well, that's a place to start. Okay. But one of the problems everyone notes, right, is this, and the article that Charlie opened with notes this too, this sort of divide that you get amongst Democrats and Republicans. Now we'll note that for a lot of the effects we see, a lot of the differences we see, we did a lot of experiments about COVID back in April, throughout the fall, and in the spring. You get these sort of things like mask wearing. Okay. Now, a year ago, mask wearing, you had a 10-point divide, but most people weren't wearing masks. Now you might get a 15 percentage point divide. Well, not now, but in April, when the vaccines started, 15% point divide. But again, no, most people are wearing masks. Now, the problem, of course, for things like this, any sort of teacher who's taught like a 500-person, introductory American government session, for example, if you have 495 people that are behaving properly and 5 who are not, those 5 who are not are going to cause a lot of problems, right? So even if the greatest difficulty and animosity is in a small group of people, that could cause some problems. But one of the questions we've asked is, so why is there so much out-group hatred? So much time in which Democrats are disliking Republicans, and again, Republican citizens, and Republicans are disliking Democratic citizens. And one of the reasons is because of, to some extent, these partisan bubbles, right? That everyone people note, oh, neighborhoods are not as, Stony Brook is actually, this area is sort of a weird for most of the country because it actually is fairly divided politically. A lot of Democrats, a lot of Republicans, a lot of places are much more concentrated. And so then you get, what ends up happening is people are making impressions of these people who they don't really know, or only know sort of partly, not typically in their families, not typically in their close friends. And then you get and this is a problem that political parties, interest groups, everyone has to deal with in the current era, especially with social media. You get identified by your loudest. And people often don't like the loudest. And oftentimes we might all agree with some of these people, they are the worst, right? And so they're more likely to think that they're obsessed with politics and they're talking about it all the time. They're more likely to think their viewpoints are extreme and out of the mainstream. We ask these questions about, if such and such a thing happened, would you engage in violence with people who are like you? Would they engage in violence? And generally everyone says, no, no, no. The other side will engage in violence. We did an experiment about the insurrection. And a big deal was made about how many Republicans were saying, oh, January 6th, a lot of Republicans supporting it. So we just did a simple experiment where we asked, do you support the people who attacked the Capitol on January 6th? And you get sort of the same numbers that a lot of people are getting, 30%, 25%. But then for another random sample, we said, the first question we did is, we asked them about the Black Lives Matter movements, and let them talk about sort of looting and rioting that had occurred with some of those stuff. And then you get to like 5% saying they support the insurrectionists. So what these people who are saying I support the insurrectionists were not saying was necessarily, I support it, so somewhere. What most of them were saying was, don't blame us. It's not our fault. These other people, these other things, you're ignoring the other stuff, you're ignoring the other stuff. And so it's always this thing that the other group is violent and us, ooh, we're sort of rough. And it's actually fairly even across parties on this sort of thing. Now, the good news is we actually are able to move ratings of out-group hatred, out-party hatred, with certain simple interventions, right? Introducing sort of people, sometimes it's, talking about, oh, the American, right? Talk about commonality. Say, actually, these people who are in the other party, they're not going to talk to your head off about politics all the time. You're not always going to be fighting. There's things you're going to agree upon, and that can all help. But the one thing we just cannot move is trust. Do you trust the people in the other party? We can say, I'm happy to have them as a neighbor, an in-law, all this sort of stuff. Democrats, if I'm a Republican, Democrats are patriotic, or Republican, all this sort of stuff. But will you trust the other side? No. Just can't really move that as much. You can think of all sorts of reasons why, right? When certain things are sort of endemic, that goes on. The other sort of interesting thing that we get to is this question of, what do people view should be done with power? And so we had asked people about questions about like executive power, constraints in the executive. And this will surprise no one, Democrats were really in favor of those in 2019 and 2020 when we started, and Republicans were opposed. And now things haven't completely shifted, but Democrats have moved in the direction of, no, constraints of executive power are bad, and Republicans have moved in the direction of constraints are good. The one thing that, in looking at previous surveys, does not change is views of protest. That is a huge political divide. Democrats are much more supportive of protest than Republicans are. Doesn't matter who's in power and what's going on there. We see constant things staying the same there. What else did I want to say based on things other people are talking about? Of course, the protest tweets at Ali. Oh, another thing that was brought up is sort of this, so we're talking about social media, right? So one of the things about the social media era that can be kind of difficult, I think, for the sort of more traditional news organizations, is that it's clear that whether we're talking about celebrities or athletes or politicians, they like to use the levers of social media to get around the traditional news media, to make sure their message doesn't get mediated in any way. But for regular citizens who are using social media, one of the questions we asked is, why are people sharing information? Why are they sharing stories on social media? Why do people post on social media about politics? Now, actually, one thing we find is that the people who post about politics are also the most likely to post about sports, their family. They just are posters. That's sort of a way some people are. And what's interesting is, for among posters, the number 2 reason they give is to express their opinion. The number 1 reason they give is to share information. Among people who don't post, and they say, why do other people do it? The number 1 reason is to express their opinion. Sharing information is at the bottom of the list. I think it was 5 or 6. Actually, no, they're just wasting time was at the bottom of the list, but this is just above it. So there's a huge also divide there between the people who post and the people who don't post on social media about what is exactly going on here. And what's interesting, though, is we've also done these sort of, generally people don't like people who post on social media, right? Pew always has this thing that only 10% of people are really posting about politics a lot on social media. And those people get generally low ratings. And so we tried to see if there's some way we can move the needle, right? So would it move the needle if essentially it was an athlete? Would Republicans like an athlete who is posting positively about Trump? Or Democrats like an athlete who's posting negatively against Trump? And all we can do is make people like the posters less, right? That's always that our party thing, likes it less. We also did a thing that was sort of similar, in which we had doctors, not real doctors. Well, it actually was a real doctor, but we attributed things to him that weren't things he said, for the experimental purposes. And what we found was that if he brought up politics, it was specifically Trump, because that was the time we're doing this. In terms of talking about the vaccine, people were less likely to believe there was going to be a vaccine that was useful then. This was back in the last summer, if the person mentioned Trump in a way they didn't like. Then all of a sudden it's like, oh, we're not going to have it. But people didn't like it more, right? They weren't like, oh, good, I'm glad he did this. This is more helpful. And so it's this sort of problem about changes is you get the twofold thing. One, there's this obvious divide, but there's also in our forthcoming book child, the other divide thing is people just generally don't like it when people inject politics into things. And especially it's partisan politics. And well, that's different. That's difficult if what you're trying to do is raise attention to things that need to be solved by parties. How do you do this without pissing everybody off? I don't have the answer. And so that becomes sort of difficult. The last thing I'd like to say, in terms of facts and change and things like this, my co-author, Yana Kripnikov, did a study that I was not part of, in which they partnered with a interest group and asked for donations to help people who lacked healthcare. And no matter how they framed it, in terms of millions of people are without healthcare, they're suffering, whatever percentages they were talking about, they couldn't move it. But when you told a story that said this one person is suffering, the money started flowing in. Okay? Shannon McGregor, who's at North Carolina, just had this paper at the American A4, what is A4? The Political Opinion Research, right? Where essentially they said, if you talked about survey data, poll data, people found that less credible than a single tweet. So it's this sort of weird world we're living in which people hate the tweeters and think, oh, this is crazy and Twitter's not real life. But because it can connect with them emotionally, they find it more believable. They're more moved by it. They're more like, oh, I gotta take an action than if you actually gave them numbers about people who are suffering. And so that's a real sort of difficult thing to work through about, okay, well, how do you put all this together to form a coalition of citizens that can bring about change, even in areas in which everybody agrees change is necessary. And so I'll say that's my time and yield the floor back.
Thank you. So now we have a chance for the panelists and Ali to talk with each other about some of these issues raised. I think, as I said, the intersectionality, I think the issue of trust, I think how do we bring about the kinds of discussions and understanding that we need if we have any chance of moving forward. But I opened it up to the four of you, and we've got about a half hour left to really hear your thoughts about all of this at this point.
Let me just offer this, okay? So in the Union Hall, we have an opportunity to have these discussions, and it's another reason that it's so important that we that we level the playing field in labor law so that more people can join unions and have discussions. What we found after a really, really difficult time, 38 months long in the United Airlines bankruptcy, we worked so hard on communications throughout that entire process. And a survey company that does a lot of Democratic polling came back and said, you're not going to believe this, but the group that you had us survey thinks that they've got it worse than any group we've ever surveyed before, ever. And so they think things are really, really bad. So you would think that that would then translate then to not trusting the union, not liking the union, whatever. 80% of that group, because we had worked so hard at communicating and defining the issues and continuing to stay close to them, 80% said their number one place that they got trusted information from was from their union. So this is on the ground. This is actually what John was referring to. This is where people see the people. This is where they react to those personal stories. They can see it and feel it in their own coworkers. And when you bring them together and you can coordinate around those stories and understand how we're all being affected by these issues, something like sick leave or healthcare, which is often an issue that you're dealing with personally. But in that collective space, you can really define the problem, talk about how that really moves people, and be in a space where people are more likely to trust because it's people that they know. And they're more likely to trust the information there. That is one of the reasons that it is so important that we build up unions, that we support workers unionizing, because this creates the space for people to have these discussions that they're not privy to anywhere else. And there's some veil of discernment about whether or not they can trust the source. But if you can create this space where they're talking with their coworkers, people that they know, and they're talking in a space where they're defining those common issues, they're more likely to build up that trust and then be able to get good information that's not just controlled by money.
One of the things that John said, and I would just love an existence in life where you talk about stuff, like a fact check. But something you said has been reflected in my visits around the country, where I gather these groups of 6 people, and sometimes they're Democrats and Republicans. Sometimes I work at curating it that way. Sometimes they're not. They're around a particular issue. So yesterday I spoke to 6 Asian Americans, don't know what their politics are. But when it comes to the issues that I talk to Sarah about, Sarah, I don't talk to you as a United employee. I don't often talk to you as a flight attendant. I talk to you as a labor leader. And Stephanie, I talk to you as an economist, even though you have both had roles in politics. Both of the issues that you are both working toward, in fact, need not be partisan political, right? I mean, labor unions in this country have been supported by people across the political spectrum, and the issues that you deal with, Stephanie, as far as taxes and debt and deficits, are also things that people across the political spectrum should be involved in and concerned about. So I'm curious how we have these discussions about the matters, that the intersectionality of all these matters, without getting mired in the partisanship, the political partisanship that so many Americans who care about these issues say they don't want to be involved in.
Oh yeah. Well, but see, the question, well, part of the problem here is this sort of if you talk about these two different things, when you're talking about sort of citizens being involved, the union members getting together, remember Barack Obama often said, I don't want to talk about that because I'm just going to screw it up. Right? It's only going to make things worse once I take a position. And so it is this sort of problem where you could see in the union hall why people would be able to bridge these divides because you're changing the common identity. So we did a study where we asked people, what we did was we asked either people questions about entertainment first or questions about politics first, and trying to see if we got attitude changes, and we really didn't. What we got was that when we asked the politics questions first, people dropped out. Even though they were being paid by a survey company to complete the survey, they just, I'm not going to do this, right? And so there is that issue when you talking about the Asian Americans, and you don't know what their politics is. Okay, well, that's part of the solution in theory, right? Is to not know, and then to reach these other things. But again, the problem is, it's hard to think about how you come up with a government-based solution that allows in which that can continue. Sort of communities can come to solutions that way, right? Groups, how are we going to get through this problem in our area that's separate from the government, or in local governments when they're sometimes nonpartisan? But when you're talking about Congress, right? Plenty of reason to believe in some of the studies we have that once Donald Trump says open the schools, that was the end of Democrats supporting schools being open. Right, that there is such a reaction against, we're seeing, and then the other problem is that's related to a lot of the stuff we're talking about is fear, right? Fear of the other side, but also fear of what's going forward. Sarah's here. I'm sure she has spent a lot of time in the air. I hate flying, very afraid of it, but I understand from a physics standpoint, it's completely safe. What we're seeing in some of the experiments we did, among the strongest Democrats, when we say, hey, what happens if everybody's vaccinated? Are these things safe? They say, no, they're not safe. It doesn't matter if everybody's vaccinated. I can't do that. I can't do that. I can't do that, because of the fear, right? The fear, even if they know, actually, no, this is probably safe. I trust the science. The fear can stop us. And that's just a sort of way of thinking about turbulence or diseases. But when we're talking about these people who we don't really know, they're in another party, who everything I see is about them being violent or whatever, that fear becomes endemic. And I don't know how to overcome that. And I don't know how to overcome that, especially given the way these communication things have to work. In our book, we talk about this thing in which it gets a lot of headlines when a couple of people were dying of COVID and saying, I thought it was a hoax, and Joe Biden is lying. And so the question is, that gets coverage. So, well, that doesn't represent how most people are experiencing COVID deaths, but it's insane to think, have the reporter go in and say, hey, by the way, your grandmother's dying. Why isn't she ranting about Joe Biden? Right? The way we talk about things is to talk about conflict. And that's necessary. There's no media or there's no stories if we're talking only about the things that get together. People will not find it interesting. They won't follow it. And it doesn't quite work. And so if we're going to constantly talk about conflict, which is both reality and something we're ginning up, people are not associating with each other. And so they paint these impressions that make them fearful of the other side. And so I'm very negative here, I guess. I don't know how you bring these things together. But that's you're gonna the three of you.
Well, think about. Let me ask you, Stephanie, because people say to me, if I tell them I had this interview with people about being Asian American, they'll assume that there's some lefty slant to it, but there isn't. I literally was having the same interview anybody would have with Asian Americans. The question, and my coverage of George Floyd was the same. In your world, you are looking at economic principles that you would like people to consider or reconsider, or maybe consider for the first time. How easily are you discounted or not discounted because of political affiliation?
Well, I guess it depends to some extent, the audience. But I think with the book, I made a very deliberate decision to try to avoid the politics and to write a book that told people that this is a way of understanding the nature of the monetary system that exists today and the mechanics of the government budget, why it's not like a household budget, and that this is a message that is aimed at empowering all of us to see through the myths and misunderstandings, to disabuse us, and to allow us greater scope for a more productive political debate, recognizing that we're still going to have differences. If I tell you there's more fiscal space out there than we've been led to believe, one reader is going to say, ooh, I want to use that fiscal space to do tax cuts or build a wall or do whatever, Another reader is going to read that and say, oh, this is a hopeful message. And I hear that a lot, right? Because I was fearful. I had a lot of anxiety about deficits and debt. And I did believe that all of this was ultimately going to lead to a harsher future for my kids and grandkids. And so they hear things differently. They say, wait a minute, if we can do more, then we could do education and we could do healthcare and we could do, so it really does. I tried very hard to leave it up to the reader, and the subtitle of the book said Building a People's Economy. And I'm not there to tell the reader what that economy is supposed to look like. And I tell them that in the pages of the book. This is for voters to decide. This is for the electorate. This is for the will of the people to exercise at the voting booth and through pressure on our elected officials. These are the things that we understand are possible, and these are the things that we want to see. So and I get calls from Republicans in Congress sometimes and their staffers. I get more calls from Democrats, but I think that there's definitely politically an understanding that it's a framework that both sides can take advantage of to just think through the political decisions about the budget and what's possible. And that, there's a way for this to benefit broadly both sides of the political aisle.
Stephanie, can I ask you a question about your experience on giving talks versus on social media? Now, having given talks in economics departments, they're rough. But I find that as a general rule, as a political scientist giving a talk to a political science audience, there's a lot more listening than sometimes you get on social media, even from fellow academics, right? That social media is much more of a how dare you say that sort of world. It's much more, especially certainly more strident. Now, again, economics is a little different than in political science talks, in which you get somebody say, okay, it's interesting that you said that. Now I'm thinking about it this way. Can you explain? As opposed to no, wrong, liberal hack, conservative, secret conservative. You get a lot of secret conservative in political science Twitter. So how do you experience it?
I get everything. I get the left says I'm a Trojan horse for the right says I'm a communist, and I get everything.
Is that different than is that different than when you're presenting?
Oh, when I'm listen, it's kind of interesting because, we haven't been doing all that many conferences, right? I still will give some papers. I'm giving keynotes at social science conferences this year, which is a different thing for me. Usually I just do, econ. So we'll see how that goes. Those are coming up in the next couple of months. But most of my public speaking is actually to folks in the investment community. They're finance people, because they actually, interestingly, they don't care so much whether it's you're associated with the left or the right. They have money on the line and they don't want to lose it. And if you have a better story about how things work and a different understanding of interest rates and inflation and the relationship between deficits and interest rates, if you bring something that they think is worthy of consideration and might help them avoid placing a costly bet that's going to cost them a lot of money, they're out there ready to listen. And so I find those audiences a lot of fun because they really don't get so riled up about the politics of it all. They're happy to have just that sort of baseline discussion about monetary operations and really clunky wonky stuff. But then I do, I'll walk into a Rotary Club and I'll talk to a bunch of Rotarians, and I love to do that as well. And, I have had almost nothing but good experiences for a couple of decades, really, of doing this kind of stuff. And I think I've learned a lot about how to lay the argument out, because I can anticipate where the pushback is going to come. I can address it early in the talk while it's popping into the listener's mind. Here it comes. Kelton is addressing that. And so I end up, I think at the end with a lot of people just, in a big circle around me saying that was incredibly interesting. And how do I learn more about that? So.
Sarah, I'm curious about this. Sorry, Charlie. I was just going to say, I'm curious about this question from Sarah's perspective, because how do you navigate the idea that you're representing tens of thousands of people whose politics might be different, but you've got a sharpened sense of where your politics lie?
Yeah. So, if you're speaking on social media and through a screen or something, people are, as Charles started to describe at the beginning of this, people are looking for ways to reinforce what they already believe, right? And so you've got to be able to approach people in a way that they're going to be able to hear it. And one of the easiest ways to do that, John, is when you're in the room with them. You can play off of their body language, how they're responding, whether or not they're paying attention, whether or not they're looking at their phone while they're doing this. And so it's a lot easier in person to do these things. And it's also why, this works in unions to have actually 90% of the workforce come together around common demands and a common plan together, where in our politics, we decide everything based on a 51% margin, right? And so, So I think that first and foremost, the only way that you can get through this is if you actually decide that you are willing to go into every room, that you're willing to talk to every person. When we were working to get our relief package done, and I just want to say right off the bat, we got management on our side, right? For the next two rounds, they had stabilized the airlines. And frankly, I had to shame them into coming along with us to continue to support this. But then we had to get the political support. And so we could not approach this as though this is a Democratic plan or a Republican plan or whatever. This had to be about the people and about what the demands were. And we went to every single office. And in fact, we got 90 senators to support our plan. So it was sort of unheard of, but it was because we demanded that we were going to go in every room. This wasn't we didn't start in the place that this was a political divide. We started in the place that this is how we're going to solve problems. And we're going to solve problems for everyone. We were able to describe it from whatever viewpoint someone came from, to be able to help them understand why this was a good solution.
So the question remains, if people are looking for information and facts, and accept only information and facts that support their position. When you look at something like vaccine hesitancy, and there was so much talk about how people of color were going to be fearful and hesitant for very real reasons, and not want to do this, and in fact, their hesitancy is now lower than white Republican men in taking the vaccination. So how do you begin to get people to understand, and a former colleague of mine that used to talk a lot about, why people vote against their best interest, but how do we get people to understand not only what's in their best interest, but is in the best interest of the people that they care about? How do we get people to take the politics out of something like vaccinations, like the mask debate? Any thoughts about that?
I think reality. Sarah,
Yeah,
go.
no, I'm just going to say that we have to try. So those stereotypes often keep us from trying, often keep us from having those conversations. And I think that there has been, this administration has wanted to focus on communities where there may be more hesitancies. And so there has been an effort there to try to get into those communities, have those conversations, bring out leaders who they trust, really work at that. And we've seen the results of that.
What I was going to say is when we did the surveys in early April, and you'd see these big partisan divides on a lot of things, but those were mostly in areas that had low case counts. When there were high case counts, people took different actions. And part of that is, and in some cases, Republicans were actually Republicans were very responsive to the number of cases in the area, right? So it is this thing of when the reality hits you on the face that people you know are dying, people will change some policies. The same sort of thing if you look at welfare support. A former grad student of mine did a paper, and this sort of question of have you previously lost your job or someone close to you lost your job changes the relationship between your risk preferences and your support for welfare, because now when you get in that mindset of this could happen to me, right? That sort of changes things, and so it's that kind of information. It's our firsthand real things that I think can sort of change some people's minds. On the other hand, right, there is this sort of reporting question, right? If you have a situation in which Charles is not wrong about white, especially male Republicans not taking the vaccine, but the vast majority of older white male Republicans, the ones who are afraid of dying, do, right? Do we get that sort of problem, this sort of famous, what's the psychologist? I think it's Cialdini, who does this thing of once you say, hey, people aren't masking, people aren't getting the vaccine, you're giving permission to people to not do it.
Yeah.
And when you're highlighting, and so as I said about the mask thing, that's the sort of problem is when you have this thing where 95% of Democrats are wearing masks and 75% of Republicans are wearing masks, which do you talk about? The vast majority of both parties are wearing masks, or that 20-point gap? And that 20-point gap theoretically could expand the gap.
Yeah.
And so it's really tough to think about it. But again, a lot of people like to blame the media on this one, but what are you supposed to say? The gap exists. I don't know how I'm supposed to write about this in a way that is both accurate, that is engaging, because you need to engage the people to get them to listen, but at the same time is socially responsible. We can all think of the absolute socially irresponsible thing to do. Right. It's much harder to come up with, well, how do I write this properly, especially given the constant need to produce content that so many people in the news media are under. I worked in TV news for a few years at local level. And once they introduced the ticker, they didn't bring in a guy to add to the ticker. It's like, now, John, you have to write all the stories and the ticker. And we didn't have, now they, that's just massively, Ali knows, of course, that's everybody's doing that. Every associate producer now has to do 5 different jobs. And so it's even harder to come up with the content in the way that's like correct, given that, especially since it's so subtle and so complicated.
Because we're just about out of time, I want to be respectful of both our audience and all of our participants' time. Any last thoughts on things that we didn't touch on, or things that you thought we were going to touch on that we didn't get to, that you want to leave us with? Any of the speakers?
Well, I'll just say something very quickly. And it speaks to your last question about how do you overcome when people have are predisposed to leaning into that which they already sympathize with, as an argument. And I think it comes back to this trust issue that we talked about earlier, right? And so when you just asked about vaccines and vaccine hesitancy and so forth, I can think of Tucker Carlson and the message that his viewers get from him. And then I think about Jerry Falwell, who, I don't know if he gave this speech or this is an upcoming thing, but as I understand it, he's either preparing to, or he recently did go out there and just try to communicate with evangelical Christians about the importance of, and so to the extent that he is a trusted figure in those communities, and they've got these two competing narratives about, the vaccine, do they lean into, do they begin to sort of gravitate toward, it's this guy that's been around forever that we trust. Jerry Falwell says, trust the vaccine, get the vaccine. I was just going to say, in Congress, I was in DC 3 or 4 weeks ago. I had a chance to catch up with Sarah while I was there, but I was there for meetings. And the only reason I'm going to tell this story is because I have the permission of the member of Congress that I'm going to tell this story about. But this is the chairman of the House Budget Committee. His name is John Yarmouth. And John read my book 6, 7, 8 months ago, whatever it was. And he wrote to me and he said, I've been a deficit hawk my whole time in Congress. And this has just completely shifted my thinking. And I want to start working with you and talking with you and so forth. So anyway, we had a dinner and a large number of lawmakers came and I was introduced, and John stood up and told the whole group, I've read this book. It has completely changed my thinking. And this makes me think, I'm saying this not to push the book, but to say that in this case, John is the trusted figure, right? He is the chairman of the budget committee. And now he is standing up in front of his colleagues saying, you can trust this message in some sense, right? I've read this and it has persuaded me. And now there are growing numbers. And so I just think it really does come back to finding a few people who are willing to cross over, that are trusted figures that can then help to, build upon that sort of building, pushing back against misinformation and the rest of it.
I think it really does come back to trust at the end of the day. And how do we trust what we're seeing? How do we trust what we're hearing? And I think we all have our work cut out for us. But I think, I truly do believe that we can accomplish what we set out to. Whether it's the union, our voices together are so much stronger than they are separate. And we need all of you and all of your voices to help raise our voices, and Ali to bear witness to what's going on. And before we got on the webinar, Ali, you commented that about the rough travel schedule, but you're talking to people around the country about their experiences, regardless of party affiliation. I think that's a model for bringing this home, for how these things impact, all of us, and stripping away the things that separate us, and really focusing on the things that bring us together is really a model and those intersections is a model that we can use to move forward. So with that, I want to thank all of our speakers. This was fantastic. I feel like we could go on forever. And it's been a wonderful experience. And I'm really thankful to all of you for taking the time in your incredibly busy schedules. I thank those who joined us today to listen to the conversation. Please follow the Center for Changing Systems of Power. We're really committed to really helping the path forward to bring together people from across the community and across the country and the world to try to make positive change. So stay engaged with us, follow the work that we're doing. We'd love you to be involved with it. And then finally, there are always people that you don't see that make this very possible. So I want to thank Eunice and Rachel and Sarah in particular for really getting us all together and making the technology work and making all the arrangements. So thank you to everybody for being here. Thank you for the participants. And we will be in touch with everybody. Thank you all.